Computers, modern technology, has enabled advances in almost all areas of today's society. They've made almost everything more effective. But there is an exception that limits society: our voting systems. This video explains the new unconditional voting system that is only possible now we have computers to make the extensive calculations for forming and reforming its constituencies. The arrangement of constituencies allows much greater accountability of MPs, which would empower campaigners on many issues, not just electoral reform. Like much modern technology, the unconditional voting system is simple to use. It requires a single mark on ballot papers, just like first past the post. However, unlike first past the post, voting is unconditional. The name indicates to voters that there are no conditions under which anything other than their preferred candidate should be selected. In electoral jargon, there are no tactical voting strategies to understand. Parties are allocated seats in direct proportion to their shares of the popular vote, so there are virtually no wasted votes. Each party's seats are then allocated to their most popular candidates. A constituency does not equate to a seat, as is the case with first past the post. In fact, constituencies are not even linked with seats, as is the case with all conventional voting systems. Each candidate will have their own constituency, from which they may or may not be returned. Constituencies will overlap, so that from any given location, any number of candidates can stand. An actual constituency map for all candidates of multiple parties would be a confusing mess. However, for voters and constituents, it is at least as simple as any system with a conventional arrangement of constituencies. From any location, for any voter, there will simply be a number of candidates standing. This gives a normal ballot paper and normal voting, where you simply mark next to a preferred candidate. Constituencies as seats that common candidates compete for result in tactical voting, where the voter must consider how the system works and have sound knowledge of the popularity of the candidates and party to ensure the most effective vote that the system can provide. Opportunities of election for candidates under these systems are as unequal as they are predictable, according to the electorate's demographics. Removing this inequality, rather than working around it, as other PR systems do, is the foundation of the exceptionally good results of the unconditional voting system. With the concept of single candidate constituencies, the only downside compared to other systems is of larger constituencies than those used in first past the post. And because this is due to the concept itself, and not to any implementation of it, the effectiveness of such a system is resistant to being watered down by politicians. The unconditional voting system algorithm draws and reforms constituencies to give them electorates that are equal according to numbers of voters for their parties at the last election. This measure is much more relevant to how those electorates might vote in the future than number of registered voters, allowing candidates more equal opportunities of election. If 600 MPs were to be returned, candidates would have a number of voters for their party at the last election of approximately a 600th of the total vote from that election in their constituencies. Parties would generally be able to provide electorally viable candidates for all voters. Thresholds are applied to votes for each candidate's constituency, so MPs cannot be mandated solely by their party's national vote. Party seats are then allocated to their most popular qualifying candidates in a way that gives an even distribution of representation to their voters, giving candidates equitable opportunities of election and voters equal opportunity of winning localised representation from those parties. Maps of parties' localised representation like these, which would include MPs' constituency boundaries, would be a way in which people who do not want to engage with how voting systems work could readily understand that their vote would have value and gain confidence in the system. The contrast to a similar map of representation from first past the post is striking. The equality of voter bases in constituencies means that where a party is more popular, they will have smaller constituencies. For example, A constituency where the party is likely to win 50% of the vote might cover the same area as two first past the post constituencies. Or a Bristol Central and South constituency could be expected to take 40% of the vote and would be formed from two and a half first past the post constituencies. Or a Reform constituency expecting a third of the vote from three first past the post constituencies. The less popular the party locally, the larger their constituency. Local constituencies of different parties need not be equitable to each other because their candidates would not be directly competing for seats. Constituencies would not be tied to first past the post boundaries. These maps are used here as their familiar measure of area and voters. Candidates would still be likely to meet the threshold in a Green constituency of Essex, equitable with 5.5% of the vote, where there are currently 18 constituencies. With current levels of support, it's likely that larger constituencies would enable all major parties across Great Britain to return local representation to all their voters. Of course, the popularity of parties will change, nationally and locally, altering their optimal number and sizing of constituencies. And what has been described wouldn't offer any accountability of MPs. These and other issues are resolved by parties standing two candidates in any locality, each from their own constituency. The most important democratic outcome of this is that it shifts the main vehicle of accountability from candidates of other parties to the other local candidate of the same party. The two candidates of a party will provide each other with more competition for votes than the local candidates of other parties, and more competition for a seat than their party's other candidates standing elsewhere. So it's goodbye to dodgy Lib Dem bar charts. Voters not needing to switch parties to remove an incumbent makes MPs accountable to their party's own voters. So MPs would be incentivised to represent their constituents, rather than the swing and tactical voters often necessary to retain a seat under first past the post and mixed systems such as AV+. Many voters will only be concerned with accountability for parties of government, and they can simply vote for a preferred party, selecting one of their candidates at random. Those votes will be shared equally between the two candidates, just as with thousands of coin flips between heads and tails, the result from random votes will be close to 50-50. This leaves the choice between candidates to voters who actually choose between them. Culturally, we're very used to wanting to remove MPs of parties we're not aligned to. But with unconditional voting, that would change. MPs would only receive nominal mandates to represent all their constituents, so they could hardly be considered to represent voters unaligned to their party come the subsequent election. Those voters imperative to remove them, and MPs' accountability to those wider electorates are substantially reduced. This gives a significantly higher democratic standard than other systems. Voters aligned to the Tories would not be able to stop a Green MP being returned, or determine which Green candidate is returned without contributing to the party's vote share. Green voters would be better able to determine who represents them, as all voters would be. There will be variation in the number of local voters for a party at the last election. So, when a party wins insufficient seats to return comprehensive representation, incumbents with smaller constituencies will have slightly reduced opportunity of election, but far less than the reduced opportunities for most candidates with conventional systems, which, as highlighted by first past the post, also skews national results. However, voters choosing between the two candidates of a preferred party on their ballot papers will be the greatest determining factor of which candidates win seats. It should be much easier to win over 1,000 voters decided for your party than 2,000 undecided voters. There can therefore be a high tolerance in variation in voter bases, which allows constituency boundaries to align with other boundaries: river, town, borough, city, conurbation or county. To the extent that if any incumbents do lose out on seats due to a smaller voter base in their constituency, it will be indistinguishable from their being held accountable. Those smaller voter bases will go without local representation from their party, which means larger voter bases will have won local representation and more voters will win local representation overall. The vote threshold, applied to constituencies, may also prevent a local candidate being returned. But this cannot unduly undermine proportionality because a party, without as many qualifying candidates as they are allocated seats, will have opportunities to fill those seats in by-elections, where there will be much less competition from parties that already have local MPs, usually every major party except the incumbent party. Any potential seats must therefore be considered when governments are formed, necessitating a wider coalition. Votes not returning an MP in a general election will still have weight for those parties in the most important and immediate result from a general election: who forms a government. However, parties that are unacceptable to voters in by-elections, such as the overt far right, are likely to remain excluded from Parliament. Voters that consider either of these likely scenarios for their preferred candidate or party may want to vote for another party, one that they think is more likely to return a candidate in their favour. However, a candidate that is considered more likely to be returned will not need another vote, so there may only be a negligible increase in leverage for making such a switch. The only sound logic for voting for a less preferred candidate is to swing what may be a marginal local result between the two candidates of another party. It'll be hard to predict where marginal results will be, so a voter attempting this will have a high risk of supporting a less preferred party without any positive outcome. This encourages parties to provide their incumbents with effective competition, while a lack of meaningful choice to protect an incumbent will drive voters away from a party. The strength of the accountability the system provides is important. When the availability of accountability is used rhetorically to hold an MP to account, it can be done with absolute certainty. Most constituencies will be the same for both the local candidates of a party, but they may overlap others of the party that are adjacent to them, in which case they will be formed with as equal voter bases as is possible. Constituencies for new alternative candidates of the party will be formed where there would otherwise only be the incumbent standing. Where such an alternative candidate wins more votes than their respective incumbent, they will additionally be given 50% of the party's vote in the overlapping area. This will give them an equal opportunity of election, as that incumbent had an opportunity equal to the other incumbent, 50%, to win the party's vote there. Voters in both areas will determine if the incumbent gains a majority of the party vote in their constituency, and the accountability of MPs to all of their local voter base and to the whole of the local electorate is no less than if the candidates had identical constituencies. Therefore, voters need not be aware of the local arrangement of constituencies and can vote unconditionally. Those are the basics of the system, so that it can be understood at a conceptual level, and anyone can understand how to cast an effective vote. The concept is totally novel, so it could not have been described with references available to people that are familiar with various other voting systems. Such innovation may be interesting to some people. However, for the purposes of policy, it must be shown that it can be politically effective. Few people in England will be aware of how any systems other than the first past the post work. Many people will never be interested in any degree of detail of any system. They will simply want to understand a system as a user, how they vote, and what representation they might expect to return. The readily understandable correlation between a vote and the local result under first past the post is why arguments about complicated voting and confusing PR systems can be effective. First past the post gives a simple connection between the vote and the result, the voter link, and therefore an implication of accountability. The single mark in itself also makes elections accessible to voters, including those who don't understand the system and don't realise why their vote will likely be ineffective. With unconditional voting, there are still the advantages of a single mark on ballot papers, But the effectiveness of voting, the voter link, and the accountability of MPs are real. The potential of accountability of MPs to their voters would likely be an important political and electoral resource. It can be expected to provide effective messaging and political leverage on numerous issues. This is largely because the concept of accountability is relatable. Many people who vote under first past the post will, at least on some level, be aware of the current lack of accountability of their MP. Those that are regularly underrepresented and frustrated at elections will be a highly receptive audience. There are so many issues to which accountability relates. Parties' corporate donors already imply that MPs do not represent their constituents. Then there are the party selection processes, dysfunctional factionalism, the excessive influence of Israeli governments and lobbying, foreign policy directed from Washington, the subsidising of domestic and foreign companies through privatised industries, and austerity, the two-child benefit cap, PIP reductions, and other policies. As campaigners, we will all be engaged on issues that are disadvantaged by the lack of accountability of MPs, just as many voters are. Some of the issues are already politically leveraged by their oppositions, but a clear solution to the systemic problem, a way to stop injustices occurring in the first place, is lacking. The question of democratic legitimacy of MPs elected with first past the post allows additional political and electoral pressure to be applied as a systemic critique across media platforms and to individual MPs in target seats. Issues around individual MPs, such as donations of luxury glasses and private boxes at football matches, would be more accessible. Challenging politicians on them in debates could be more than bringing up scandals to score points. They would highlight the culture of corruptibility in what is essentially a corporately funded political system. The dependency of political parties on donors with vested interests is the fundamental issue. It wouldn't matter if some of the donations are disavowed, as in the case of Starmer, or transparent, as in the case of Farage, suggesting a donor's company will receive contracts after elections. The issue is with the culture of Westminster. Both parties that might win the election rely on such funding. That they are both open to corruption in this way shows the lack of real choice the electorate faces, both at large and in many constituencies. One of the reasons why many people are inactive on the issue is likely their lack of ability to do anything about it, because of first past the post. At elections, electorates are unable to question where power lies and achieve a resolution. An electorate might only decide which party the power flows through. Conservative donors, such as JCB switching to Reform, is a prime example of this lack of choice. It should be normal that Starmer's constituents, who share Labour's principles, have an opportunity to replace him with a candidate they're aligned to. Emphasising that MPs could be replaced by other candidates of the same party would remove any implication of self-interest in the line of attack, which is a considerable weakness of arguments for PR. It concentrates focus on those MPs empowering their constituents. Should it be opportune, linking the issues on which MPs should be accountable to how they are currently elected, would describe issues such as austerity in the context of how politics functions. Political theory could be made more relatable and a practicable solution offered. Citing policy or explicitly advocating for electoral reform are unnecessary to hold the political system and MPs to account rhetorically and MPs in target seats electorally. Such a policy would simply hold the receipts, as policy generally does. Neither the system our policy currently supports, AV+, nor STV would improve the accountability of MPs to the same degree. Without going into an in-depth analysis of those systems, the fact that in the wake of the expenses scandal, no effective popular mandate was won for making MPs accountable demonstrates the weakness of PR systems in this regard. The public anger around the expenses scandal made it an ideal opportunity for electoral reform for accountable representation. But only a system that would let voters remove every single incumbent might have allowed that anger to be met with effective rhetoric. The most popular facet of first past the post, compared to PR systems, is in its small constituencies with single MPs. Much of the attraction is likely to boil down to that representation being readily understood. Constituencies, at least in name, may correspond to people's sense of place, and people can easily understand being in a single MP's constituency. The representation is relatable. It allows a sense of control and connection to Parliament, no matter how illusory it actually is. The unconditional voting system also gives a single local MP from a party, usually every party that meets the local threshold. Such single MPs could also be readily identified with, especially by those wanting representation of their political views from an MP of the party, if not the candidate that they voted for. The system electorally incentivises MPs in smaller constituencies to fulfil the role of constituency MP as they will gain increased name recognition. Preferences for or disapproval of those MPs' local representation would factor into voting, just as they do with first past the post, strengthening the voter link that for some is an important feature of parliamentary representation. If the more popular of the candidates of the party offering the most localised representation in any place is not returned, they will win a seat without a parliamentary vote to fulfil the role of constituency MP. This will aid in maintaining the role as an institution that carries considerable weight in local politics. That institution should be maintained, but not at the expense of electoral democracy, as is currently the case with first past the post. Unconditional voting would give less churn of MPs, as incumbents would only lose their seats because they are unpopular, not because of local and national swings in their party's popularity, as is usually the case with first past the post. This greater familiarity with local MPs would strengthen the voter links compared to first past the post, as well as allowing more effective governance due to the greater experience of parliamentarians. Retrospectively, had a voting system that allowed the removal of every single MP being available, the Iraq War and parliamentary vote that took us into it, and the expenses scandal could have led to considerable support for electoral reform. As it was, the Iraq War, the expenses scandal, the Lib Dems voting to triple tuition fees, Brexit, and austerity from Labour and the Conservatives have all severely degraded trust in politics, and Farage has flourished, giving a voice to the discontent. Looking to the future, only elections under unconditional voting would ensure that local voters are able to hold to account every MP that they consider to be complicit in the genocide in Gaza, without voting for a party that they otherwise don't want to support. First past the post is consistently a good system to use messaging on accountable representation under, because some MPs, those in target seats, will be accountable to swing and tactical voters, and the group most empowered by accountable representation, voters aligned to an MP's party, but not the MP. Many of those MPs will be identified with issues, including the genocide in Gaza, that can be leveraged to remove them. Local campaigns can reference those issues while offering a systemic critique of our political system and a solution, keeping campaigning positive, building on any issues of accountability at the national level, and getting both activists and voters out. Increasing the political leverage of the Palestinians' plight in this way can even be expected to positively influence any government's policy. The outstanding issues that are apparent from the description of the unconditional voting system already given are how the even distribution of representation is achieved and how the system copes with fluctuations in parties' seat shares. They are both resolved in the allocation of seats to candidates. In polling districts, where a candidate is allocated a seat, the other candidate of the party will have their vote suspended. This may limit or void their chances of being returned, and therefore increase the chances for candidates from elsewhere. This and the alignment between voter and representation concentrations in constituencies gives an even distribution of representation. If a party returns candidates from all polling districts where its constituencies meet the threshold and has remaining seats, then the suspended votes are reinstated and those additional seats are allocated to the party's remaining candidates. 2 MPs of a party may therefore be returned from areas where they had identical constituencies. This will be due to increases in the party's local vote share, because the party's vote is divided equally between the 2 candidates, as neither were sufficiently popular to stop the other being returned, or both factors will apply. Successful candidates' common areas will be divided between them to represent, drawn according to their popularity in polling districts and to give rational, relatable constituencies. This gives voters a single MP of a party. MPs will be more identifiable and the constituencies will be smaller, giving more localised representation. For the next election, the constituencies of some incumbents may require reforming to give them equitable voter bases. Again, this would be according to their popularity in individual polling districts, as well as to give rational, relatable boundaries. Constituencies of MPs that had the same electoral constituencies at the last election will have been divided in 2. So when reformed to an equitable size, they will have more voting districts in common with other incumbents of their party from adjacent, now overlapping constituencies. The more voters incumbents have in common with adjacent incumbents, and the more popular that competition is, the less an incumbent's chances of re-election will be. Where incumbents scrape through due to an increased popularity of their party, votes to hold them accountable would still have been effective, but it may take a further election to remove them. For the first unconditional voting election, incumbents' constituencies from the last first-past-the-post election will be reformed, as if they were constituencies from a prior unconditional voting election. So, all current MPs would be accountable to their current constituents. This can be expected to make reform less vague to voters and nullify many spurious arguments against reform for MPs. Current MPs' reform constituencies may overlap more, and the chances of re-election will be less if they won their seats with low shares of the total local vote, empowering voters who had the greatest imperative to vote tactically under first past the post. And of course, voters who don't like either candidates from a preferred party can switch parties. The number of constituencies a party has may therefore increase in line with their seat allocation. MPs will be more accountable and more likely to lose their seat where their party's representation is greater relative to their support, and vice versa. Across the country, this will also give a tendency for a more even distribution of representation. If a party does not meet the threshold in some of their constituencies, there will be more seats available that might allow additional MPs to be returned from other places. So, in a general election, the threshold will only affect the number of seats allocated to the smallest parties, and the localisation of representation can be increased. While candidates' chances of election will change, incumbents' opportunities of election will be constant. They will always need more votes than other candidates of the party they share ballot papers with. And if those vote counts are close and the party wins less seats, they may also have to win more votes than other candidates of the party stood elsewhere. Where a party won insufficient seats to return comprehensive representation, or MPs stand down before the next election, constituencies will be formed or reformed to allow all candidates of the party equal opportunities of election. A party with falling vote shares will see its constituencies expanded and overlapping each other more, making them more accountable as the popularity of their party declines. Areas with no MP of the party may be subsumed into adjacent constituencies or form into fewer, larger constituencies for new candidates. The number of MPs a party needs to retain representation for all its voters can therefore be reduced as well as increased. To summarise, the constituencies are dynamic, responding to the popularity of local MPs and of parties nationally, while maintaining boundaries and therefore representation from their MPs that is more relatable to constituents and voters. It is obvious that some parties, invariably those that support PR, have significant self interest in such electoral reform, as was the case with Farage at the last election. This can easily induce cynicism, making those parties look out of touch with voters who will be more concerned with other issues such as the cost of living. Some voters may even associate the Lib Dems' time in government with PR, given their tripling of tuition fees, enabling austerity, and their deal for the failed referendum on an alternative vote. There are further ways in which campaigning on the issue of PR is not compatible with increasing support for a party or winning elections. However, the fundamental bar to effective electioneering on the issue of PR is that, as an issue, how voting systems affect representation doesn't cut through with the electorate. It doesn't matter how perverse and paradoxical that is. YouGov polling on the importance of national issues such as the economy, NHS, and immigration doesn't even give it as an option. Parties supporting PR avoid being excessively associated with it, so they're not seen as out of touch, which in turn limits the attention the issue gets and the popularity of any mandate for reform that might be won. The necessary fundamental argument for making MPs accountable to voters can be won by highlighting their unaccountability on hot issues. In some situations, a reform that makes MPs accountable to their voters might be cited, but details about how the system works would not be entered into, just as they aren't for PR, or generally speaking, any other policy. Only once an effective popular mandate for reform has been won would it then be advantageous to disseminate the advantages of how the system works. The marginal gains that are likely to come from this policy due to the additional focus on opposing MPs and anti-establishmentarianism could combine to give considerable improvements in election results and growth of the party at all levels. It is worth considering the likelihood of attacks on this policy, because it would almost certainly be beneficial to lean into them. Who thinks that empowerment as voters isn't popular? Who, in the 21st century, thinks that counting votes using a system from the Middle Ages is appropriate? Why should tactical voting be tolerated? Britain has a long, proud history of democratic innovation, such as the single transferable vote system in the 19th century, the Bill of Rights, and even the development of the parliamentary system itself. Democratic progress will attract opposition from establishments, but ultimately, legitimacy for any democratic reform cannot come from those in positions of power, but from the people. If opponents do blunder into such attacks, then they'll enable us to increase support for our party, especially amongst anti-establishmentarian disruptive voters who are often receptive to Farage's messaging. There is no such thing as bad publicity for good policy, but as ever, it must be effectively handled, especially by our leadership. Our policy must align with our principles, both within the policy state and space, so it's coherent, and so that we can campaign more effectively, assured of our position. Only accountability ensures that representation is any more than nominal. As such, it's a fundamental of an effective representative democracy. Accountability is not only essential for democratic principles and effective elections, but everything we want as a party. Only a society able to give meaningful consent can be transformed to be fairer and greener through legislation and governance. Our policy will continue to support proportional representation as a significant number of activists committed to electoral reform have campaigned on for many years. But with the unconditional voting system and accountable representation, we have an opportunity to take a more holistic approach to improving democracy, government, and the political culture in the UK.